Hello and welcome to the first International Neuroethics Society webinar on do-it-yourself neuromodulation, which is the first in a series organized by the Emerging Issues Task Force of the INS. I am Nicole Martinez, the new chair of this task force, which is comprised of an interdisciplinary and international team of neuroethicists committed to bringing attention to important neuroethical issues of interest to members of the society and the general public. My esteemed colleagues on the task force are Laura Cabrera, Michigan State University, Adrian Carter, Monash University, Australia, Jennifer Chandler, University of Ottawa, Canada, Ishan Dasgupta, University of Washington, Philip Kellmeyer, University Medical Center, Freiburg, Germany, Carola Kreitmeier, University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Anthony Weiss, Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, Harvard Medical School. The Emerging Issues Task Force is hosting this webinar series to bring together expertise from around the world to examine timely and important issues in neuroethics. The topics we have chosen for this series are meant to engage people at all levels in neuroethics issues by providing thoughtful conversation among leading neuroethicists. Before we move to the webinar, I will briefly introduce some of the upcoming topics. In February, we have a powerful webinar scheduled of scientific oppression, biological reductionism, and the future of neurotechnology, moderated by the chair of the INS Diversity and Inclusion Task Force, Tim Brown. In the upcoming months, we will also be addressing topics such as global neuroethics, brain data governance, the rise in telemental health, and environmental neuroethics. We hope that you will be able to join us for this exciting series. As a reminder, recordings of our webinar will be available to watch on the INS website. Now I'll give you to Ishan Dasgupta, your moderator for today. Thank you.
So I think Ishan and my fellow panelists can join us now.
Hi.
Hi. Maybe Ishan is having some trouble with his camera.
Again, thank you, Nicole, for that great introduction.
There he is. There he is. All right.
So pleased to have everyone and our expert panel. I'm just going to quickly introduce everyone. Starting off, Anna Wexler is an assistant professor of medical ethics and health policy at the University of Pennsylvania. Anna received her PhD in 2017 in the History, Anthropology, Science, Technology, and Society program at MIT, where she examined the ethical, legal, and social implications of emerging technology, with a particular focus on do-it-yourself and direct-to-consumer electric brain stimulation. At Penn, she's extending her work to address ethical and regulatory challenges raised by a full spectrum of interventions used in the home to modify brain function. She also plans to explore how do-it-yourself movements, direct-to-consumer health products, and citizen science initiatives are disrupting traditional models of science and medicine. From 2015 to 2016, Anna was a visiting scholar at the Center for Neuroscience and Society at the University of Pennsylvania. And prior to her return to academia, Anna spent several years as a documentary filmmaker and science writer, where she produced the documentary Unorthodox. Thank you so much for Anna joining us from the East Coast. Next is Carola Kreitmeier. She's an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Carola received her PhD in philosophy from Stanford in 2013. She completed a clinical ethics fellowship at the Stanford Center for Biomedical Ethics before joining the faculty at UW School of Medicine in the Public Health in the Department of Medical History and Bioethics. Her recent work includes ethical issues around allocation strategies for critical resources in light of COVID-19, including scarcity. Carola is also working on the ethics of digital behavioral technology with a particular focus on the phenomenological, epistemological, and existential implications of self-tracking technology. In addition, she's considering problems regarding the ethical duties generated by consciousness, such as in minimally conscious state patients and cerebral organoids. Outside of academia, Carola writes and directs plays. Her most recent play, Homo Ex Machina, explores existential questions brought on by deep brain stimulation. Carol will be joining us from the Midwest. Thank you for joining us. And lastly, Marcello Ienca. He's a senior researcher at ETH Zurich in Switzerland. Marcello is in the Health Ethics and Policy Lab at the Department of Health Sciences and Technology. He is a PI of several different projects, first on neurotechnology, artificial intelligence, and human rights, one on digitalizing elderly care, and lastly on personalized and preventative care. He's also involved in projects on AI ethics, big data in health research, and data protection in personalized health. His research focuses on the ethics and governance of biomedical data, ethically aligned artificial intelligence, neuroethics, and responsible innovation for emerging technologies at the human-machine interface. Prior to joining ETH, Marcello obtained master's degrees from Humboldt University and KU Leuven, and a PhD degree from the University of Basel. He's published extensively on these topics and also received several awards for social responsibility in science and technology. With that, I'd like to start off with a very general question that helps our audience sort of understand the contours of this topic. So with that, I'll start and ask the entire panel, when people refer to something like DIY neurotechnology, what does this mean? And what are some current examples of DIY neurotechnology?
I can.
Go ahead, Anna.
Go ahead,
Anna. So I've thought a lot about what the term DIY means, and I think it's interesting to just think about for a moment what people mean when they say DIY. So people use, and so it actually carries with it, I think, a lot more meaning than people at first realize, right? So we usually use it to modify, let's say, a product or an activity, but it carries a lot of meaning about what the societal norm is regarding that activity, but also who has the expertise to do that activity. So to give you an example, people often talk about DIY bathroom remodeling or construction projects, right? So if I told you I was doing a DIY bathroom remodel, that would probably make sense to you because it's pretty clear I'm not a professional contractor, right? I don't seem to have the professional expertise to be doing that, right? But if a professional contractor said the same thing, that person, he or she, right, probably wouldn't use the term DIY because they have the expertise to do that, right? So it's making a statement about what the norm is, the societal norm is regarding who has the expertise to do a certain activity. So along those same lines, right, I wouldn't say I do DIY dishes or DIY laundry because we don't think of those as activities where certain expertise is required, right? So coming back to neurotech, right, when we think about these devices like stimulating devices or devices that record, we typically think of them as devices that require some expertise, right? Either it's a scientist or a researcher, and they're typically used in a certain setting. And so when we use the modifier DIY, we really mean it's outside, right? It's something that's used outside of that typical setting. So often by lay individuals and used at home instead of the research or clinic. So that's my reflection on DIY.
I tend to agree with Anna. I think this is a pretty accurate description, and I really like this sort of epistemic-based definition of DIY based on the notion of expertise. I think there's also maybe an additional nuance to that, which is the nuance about personal autonomy and freedom to innovate. I tend to see the DIY movement strongly linked to the open development and open science movement, including a lot of grassroots movements such as the citizen science approach. And the DIY neurotech community, just as many other DIY biotech communities, also include individuals who do have expertise, but they do not conform to a mainstream model of proprietary tech development and pursue open development approaches. And I think this is also an interesting component of this movement.
Yeah, and I think there's a further distinction that is useful to think about, and I think Marcello hinted at it, but there's DIY in the research realm and people who are using DIY neurotechnology to pursue their own research, maybe outside of the umbrella of an academic institution or some sort of institution like that. And then people are employing DI neurotechnology for applications to, what would in in the sort of clinical realm be called clinical applications, but these are not generally clinical devices. And so the devices might be applied in a method to enhance oneself, to strive for self-optimization, to engender certain benefits that one thinks can come from that technology. So those are sort of two separate goals of DIY neurotech.
Great. That's, I think, a great introduction to sort of give us the contours of what DIY means. I'll leave with another follow-up question. Oftentimes you hear about DIY versus direct to consumer, stands for, or often known as DTC. In what ways do you see that direct to consumer DTC neurotechnologies differ from DIY? Are they sometimes similar? Are they sort of part of the a broader collection, or in what ways do you see that they're distinct?
I guess we could just go in the same order, I guess. I think that it depends on what your definition really is here, right? So if you think of DIY as something that's, right, without certain kinds of expertise, or to add on to Marcello's point, right, maybe some people do have some expertise, but I think also the setting is different, right? So it's, let's say, home versus a clinic or something like that, right? So you can think of DIY writ large as encompassing direct-to-consumer neurotechnologies, and that it's individuals with either little expertise or no expertise or some expertise using these technologies outside of the clinical or scientific setting. So in that definition, it would also encompass direct-to-consumer neurotechnologies. But I think when people think about true DIY, they think about people like creating a kit or really creating a certain device at home using wires, right? Not a prefabricated device. And direct to consumer is more off the shelf, right? Put on the headband and it's there. So I think that's the definition or what people think about. And the last thing I'll just say quickly is that I did a study of users of direct to consumer neurotech devices. And one of the questions we asked them was how much they identify with the term DIY. It was DIY, transcranial direct current stimulation, and about half said that they identified with that term and half didn't. So there is some blurriness there, I think.
Mm-hmm. I mean, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, direct-to-consumer devices can be very polished, very, well marketed, well designed devices that can be quite expensive, that make certain claims about their effectiveness or what they can achieve, and you purchase them as a consumer product, like you would purchase any consumer product online, and anyone can purchase it. So it carries with it a whole industry, sort of industry of consumer products that is in the business of trying to make a profit from selling neurotechnology.
Yeah, Marcello?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add. I probably on I have a slightly different view on this topic, because I tend to see DIY and DTC as quite different. Then, of course, these are two approaches to technology development that have one obvious area of overlap and a common denominator, which is that they are both oversight-free approaches, or at least approaches that tend to have a less robust oversight compared to mainstream approaches to technology development, for example, in the biomedical research or clinical domain. But they are quite different to the extent that DTC neurotech is usually manufactured and commercialized by profit-oriented companies who tend to make these products to make some profit, and they see the recipients as customers, so as passive recipients of previously manufactured products. Whereas the DTC approach does not share this premise. It's typically a non-profit oriented movement, which tends to have a very open development, decentralized approach. And most importantly, DTC companies do not like so much when DIY neurohackers then modify the software or the hardware of their products. And when this has happened, and it has happened, then this has usually led to controversy with the manufacturers of DTC neurotech. And I think another interesting difference is that this open development approach that many DIY users have. And again, here the word users is probably not the best one, because you're at the same time the user and the developer, which again is something that you do not see in the DTC context.
Got it. Excellent answers. I think that helps us really understand sort of some of the differences. I want to follow up with an audience question we got. I think it fits in this section of our discussion from Stuart Nolan. Could you guys say a little bit more about the historical roots of DIY neuromodulation? When did this sort of start? What kind of things were people doing?
I could take this one.
Sure.
Given that my PhD focused on this. So the modern DIY movement started in late 2011, early 2012. And that really began when I think people began reading stories in the media about TDCS and the potential effects both for enhancement and treatment. And so in the early days, it was these forums on Reddit, which still exist today, and also some other blogs. And then in the, very early on, it was people, making their own devices, using parts from Radio Shack, posting videos on YouTube. And then what happened was you started to see other individuals, entrepreneurial individuals, selling do-it-yourself kits, often from their basements. And then 2013, 2014 is when you first start to see the real companies coming to market. And today there's a bit more Silicon Valley investment in the space, which I think we'll get to later. It's also very briefly worth noting that historically, at least in the US, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was actually quite a big home electrotherapy movement where people used to buy these medical batteries and electrical stimulation devices and use it on themselves all over their body, not just their heads, for health improvement.
Got it. I'll ask another audience questions because I think it fits here. In terms of DIY, how common is it that users will rely on on-the-shelf components to construct these devices rather than relying on direct-to-consumer technology manufactured for that purpose? So basically, I think this is asking, right, how often do people go to Radio Shack or Home Depot and figure out something off the shelf to adjust it? Do we really see that happening? Is it common?
I could take it, but I'll leave it to someone else if anybody else wants to.
Well, I can take it too. I mean, I think this is a quite common approach. You see both approaches happening. So there is a lot of DIY research that is based on repurposing DTC technologies. This is, of course, a major shortcut because you already have a hardware and a software that are designed for the purpose of neuromonitoring or neuromodulation. Whereas if you self-assemble your own device from scratch, then you need a higher degree of expertise because you need to make a neurotechnology from scratch. But taking the shortcut and starting with from DTC, so from repurposed DTC neurotechnologies, has the disadvantage that these technologies are typically closed sourced. And this is again a major difference between DTC products and DIYs. So typically you need to crack the software of a DTC neurotech product in order to make it open and available for development. And there is also a record of litigations that occurred precisely because the proprietary software of some DTC products was opened up for further development by DIY neurohackers.
That makes sense. So there has to be a little bit more sort of expertise before you start messing around with these things, right? Most people probably can't just go off the shelf and figure out, how to change a DTC product for their own use.
I think behind this is also just a kind of more big picture resistance to the idea of professionalism and certain silos who are permitted to do, these are people who have PhDs and are, employed by these kind of institutions are allowed to do research. The other people aren't. They're just allowed to kind of, be consumers. And I think the DIY movement, including sort of DIY biohacking and this is kind of pushing, the citizen science movement is pushing against that and saying, there should be a more democratized approach to who is permitted to engage in these sorts of activities, which brings with it its own concerns, because there are certain norms that are in place in kind of professional circles that aren't in place. And depending on exactly what the research is, some research might be quite benign, but other research might not be. And so it's definitely a growing area where the norms are still being worked out, and to what extent there are connections with sort of professionalized institutions and to what extent they really are very distinct is still in flux.
It's so interesting. I'll just say the different ways that we approach answering or even thinking about that question. Because when I see, my first instinct was to see how, the question was how common is it? And so I think, well, what empirical data, right? Just coming from a theological perspective, well, what do we know data-wise just about like the use of these devices? And then what percentage of that use or those devices would be for DIY versus DTC? So there is no good data on that. What does exist is a survey that I did and another survey that Anita Joie did from Stanford, looking at users of those devices. And I think in the early days, there were more people using, like actually creating their own devices. But it seems that activity on that front has sort of died down. Again, there's no data here, but if you look at the forums, there's less people talking about that and more people talking about off-the-shelf, I don't know if I want to call them direct-to-consumer, more off-the-shelf products, less creating their own. So, but when I think about it, I think there's not really any good data in this space.
Which is an interesting sociological fact, I think. I think this is quite common with DIY movements in general, because they tend to occur underground to a large extent. So it's much harder to gather data from these communities, and probably even the word community is not a perfect fit sometimes, because you have individuals who pursue these activities quite independently from the rest. And yes, I agree. Most of the considerations we were making are based on anecdotal evidence, at least from my perspective, is anecdotal evidence based on several rounds of engagements and interactions with members of this community. But I share Anna's point that we do not have good data about this.
That's great. This is a fantastic conversation. We're moving right along. I want to ask another general question to the group. What do you think is the most pressing ethical issue in either the DIY or DTC space? I'll start with Carola.
Sure. Well, I think that it's really hard to separate, and I'll focus maybe on DTC, but it's hard to separate out DTC neurotechnology from the larger realm of kind of digital technology, in the sense of sort of personal mobile digital technology, like wearables, like smartphone apps, even including the Internet of Things and the smart devices that populate our environments, and then the AI-powered assistants that really make all those devices work for you, quote unquote, because there is massive interconnectedness between these devices. So you might have a neuro device that is communicating with your phone, that is communicating with objects in your house, and that gives it a lot of power. But it also means that there's just a ton of data that can be used in multiple ways. And so, that leads to a lot of security threats. It leads to threats both in terms of, you know, the safety of the devices in case they are breached, but it also leads to, so for instance, there was that case a couple of years ago where they showed that a implanted pacemaker was actually vulnerable to hacking, and so they had to recall these 500,000 implanted pacemakers because they could be manipulated, and of course that's something very dangerous. You don't want someone hacking into your pacemaker. So the more these objects become interconnected, the more they become vulnerable to these breaches, because there's always these sort of weak links in this sort of Internet of Things that can that has all these data connections. So there's just the security aspect of it, and then of course there's the issue, and I think this is probably more pressing, the issue of what happens with all that data. Who's allowed to have that data? And we're talking, so with direct to consumer, these are private companies who then have a ton of data, and again, it can be integrated with data from a number of different sources. AI can be, machine learning can be applied to find some really very powerful insights in terms of sort of digital phenotyping. And then this can be used to decide, this can be sold to marketers, to insurance companies, to employers, but it can also be used to make decisions about what sort of services to offer to you or not. And I think as a society, we have to make the decision about what should happen with this data, who should be allowed to have access to it, what sort of inferences ought to be drawn, and then what kind of protections can we put in place if we don't think it should be the case that wearables can directly communicate with your insurance company, and you know, their policies can be drawn up depending on different behaviors you do. So I think those issues are really pressing, and I think we need I think we probably need some regulation on that front.
Anna, do you want to go next?
Sure. And I feel like what we've sort of missed so far in the discussion is just an outline of what these technologies are. Like, yeah. I know you asked, Ishan, you asked in the beginning for some examples, and I did not answer that part of your question. So like, I'm not sure how familiar the audience is with those kinds of technologies. And I know that myself, Carola, and Marcella all have different definitions of what we would include in DIY or direct-to-consumer neurotechnology. So given that we've shifted a little bit to direct-to-consumer neurotechnology, I'll just talk about what I think are the 4 categories that I've seen as included in direct-to-consumer neurotech. And those are devices that record from the brain, so neuromonitoring devices. So for example, EEG recording devices that are sold directly to consumer. Again, there's a company called Open Source BCI that does open source, you know, where you could do an open source version of the EEG, but it's recording. Stimulation, so sending some kind of electrical or magnetic simulation into the brain. I've also included cognitive training. So the definition I've used broadly of DTC neurotech are products that are sold to consumers without necessitating the physician as intermediary, so sold directly to consumers with a marketing intention to either modulate or manipulate brain function. So neurorecording, neurostim, cognitive training, we've included, my colleague Peter Reiner and I have included in that. So games like Lumosity, and finally mental health apps we've also included in that definition. So broadly, those are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about when I think about DTC neurotech. I don't know if Marcello and Carola, you want to talk about
think that I agree with all of those devices or types of devices being part of DTC neurotechnology. I think it's useful to think of those as DTC neurotechnology, but I also think that a lot of the ethical issues that are generated is how those kinds of devices are interwoven with other platforms. And so I do think that if you want to think about, so for instance, I think virtual reality is a further thing that can be included in DTC neurotechnology, especially if individuals are able to use it very much on the go in a sort of personal mobile way, and that then connects up with all the companies who with the kind of aims of the companies that are producing these technologies and what other products they're making, what other aims they have. And so while it might be very useful to categorize the DTC neurotechnology somewhat discreetly, it does very much seep out into other commercial applications of various technologies.
Marcello, anything to add?
Yeah, no, first of all, I share 100% the views of Carola and Anna on this, especially Anna's definition. Are probably I heard some people add also VR systems and include them into the DTC neurotech. I'm a bit more reluctant because then my fear is that if even VR becomes neurotech, then everything is a neurotech in some sense. But regarding the most pressing ethical issue, which I think was the original question, I have sometimes I have a hard time, with ethical hierarchies, trying to determine what should be ranked as the number one ethical issue, because I tend to see ethics in a more holistic way, and ethical assessment in a more holistic way, and also different technologies typically raise different ethical issues. So I share 100% Carola's views on data privacy, and I think that this is a major ethical issue. But this is a very important ethical issue when it comes to DTC neurotechnology, not so much when it comes to DIY, because typically DIY users retain the data they collect. And this technology is only aimed at self-monitoring purposes. Whereas in the DTC domain, you typically have companies whose primary aim is to collect and mine data from end users, possibly on a large scale. So trying to have as many customers as possible in order to have as many data as possible in order to train their algorithms in the most efficient way, and trying to glean as much information as possible from those data. And I think this is a very interesting and novel privacy issue in the neuroethics domain, because in neuroethics, we are used to think about neuroprivacy in terms of brain reading. We have decades of debates on brain reading, and typically these debates on brain reading are about fMRI, sometimes structural MRI, sometimes more novel approaches to imaging. But in any event, is basically the problem of developing one day one neurotechnology that is so comprehensive and efficient that can use reverse inference in order to decode mental states and reveal mental content, semantic content from mental states. And I think this is a very interesting ethical issue, but we are nowhere close to this. What these DTC companies can do is an instance of the big data privacy problem. So we do not have a technology that can reveal the semantic content of mental states. We are not even close to that. But we can have 100,000 or possibly one day million of minimally reliable devices that can collect data from millions of users. And this data can be aggregated with other online available data. And this is the reason why I like Carola's view of seeing DTC neurotech in continuity with other digital behavioral technologies. And this data mining process can lead to reveal sensitive information from non-sensitive data. And this is, the typical big data privacy problem that we see in the digital infosphere. We can make inferences about a person's pregnancy status based on their Amazon purchases. And here again, we will be able at some point, if many people adopt DTC neurotechnologies, to make privacy-sensitive inferences from non-privacy-sensitive data, including fully de-identified or even anonymous data. For example, group-level privacy issues could emerge, right? We don't know anything about any individual user, but if we aggregate data on a large scale, we can establish, for example, statistical associations between responses to cognitive tests and IP addresses. And then we can tell that certain people who live in a certain geographic area tend to be slower at cognitive tests. And maybe, people who live in that area are people who suffer from a greater degree of poverty or are from lower socioeconomic strata. And this is, a typical example of making associations that are privacy sensitive at the group level. And this can happen even if we use anonymous data, or say, more a group of people is more prone to developing Alzheimer's dementia, because some neurological biomarkers of cognitive decline can be found. So I think, and this is a problem that doesn't apply so much to DIY, but then in the DIY domain, you have different issues. For example, the personal autonomy and the right to science issue, which I think it's a very important ethical issue. I tend to be a big supporter of the right to science and of a universal approach to the right to science, which also includes the right to citizen science. And I think this is an ethical issue that a lot of people in DIY domain see as very important, but doesn't apply much to the DDC. But of course, there is, as I mentioned before, this oversight-free nature of these two domains also raises shared ethical challenges. I think an important one has been extensively researched by Anna, which is the scientific validity and the quality control of these products. So, a lot of these devices are not reliable, and they have received very little validation and testing. And this is something that needs to be further investigated. And then also the issue of responsible innovation. I think one thing that DTC and DIY have in common is that at some point we should all, neuroethicists and manufacturers and experimenters and all the other relevant stakeholders could work together on developing a more proactive and participatory approach to responsible innovation in this domain, and trying to align these technologies with ethical principles and values early on in the design and development process.
Can I just, I'll add, I think those were both Carola and Marcello, those are really fantastic outlines of like the broad scope of all the ethical issues at play here. I'll just add that the way, just a different framing that I bring to this, or at least the way that I think about this, is just time-wise, right? So it's thinking about it in a temporal window. So what issues, and also with regard to Marcello's point about different ethical issues, different technologies raise different ethical issues. So I think about this temporally in time. So what issues are present now for, let's say, each of the 4 categories of devices that we have set out? What do we see as being on the near-term horizon? So in the next 5 years, let's say, right? And then what's in the future? So that's how I sort of think about it and categorize it in my head. And so I think all the issues that both of you mentioned, I think are there. I just might place them in certain categories that I think we'd actually probably agree on where they were in that temporal window. But when I think of the most pressing issues in those temporal windows, right? So for me, the most pressing issue now is misleading claims made by companies, and as Marcello mentioned, right? Like, do these devices really work, or are what the companies claiming about what these devices are doing, is that true? And are they being transparent about what the device can actually do? So for me, that's the most pressing immediate concern. In the medium term, I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with these devices in certain specific contexts. So like the workplace, I think will be a very interesting spot where we'll see a lot of issues potentially arise. And I say midterm for that one, just because there's evidence of certain EEG technologies being piloted in workplace settings to do things like detect drowsiness. School settings are another specific setting where there might arise specific ethical issues. And again, there's one case in China where actually an American company came into Chinese schools and had kids wear EEG monitoring devices and then reported the results back to their teacher and parents, right? But that's just right? And when I think of the midterm, I think of issues in specific settings. And then in the future, as Marcello really articulated very well, right? What are these devices going to be able to, what are they going to be able to reveal about us, right? Even just by using AI or machine learning, right? Just by associations, what data are they going to be able to reveal? So for me, those are the main 3 things in those different time windows.
Can I
Yeah, absolutely.
comment on the first point Anna made? And I think I love the way you're breaking them down into these three temporal stages. I think this idea of the misleading claims, I agree that's a very pressing issue, and I think it taps into again, sorry if I'm speaking sort of a big picture, but it taps into this larger sociological, I think, development of responsibilization of the individual, and the idea that the individual has to take responsibility for their productivity, for their health, for their well-being, for all these aspects of themselves, and really this ideal of self-optimization that neurotech taps into in the same way wearables do. And again, like I'm gonna see them on this continuum. The idea that if you can just track yourself, you can perfect yourself and you can optimize yourself. And here, not only is it really problematic if these devices are not actually effective at tracking certain dimensions, because then you are, it seems like we have this responsibility to self-optimize, but we're actually given sort of poor tools to do so, and that in itself can be very detrimental to an individual's sense of self. But I think from where I'm standing, I want to challenge this whole sort of drive towards self-optimization and responsibilization of the individual. I think this is probably a more long-term issue, but I think this has the potential to lead to more kind of overload of self-reflective information about of the individual. So by constantly, wearing a wearable that tells you your blood sugar, your sweat composition, your reading your EEG, you're getting all this self-reflective information. And my sort of big picture concern is that it is taking people out of the actual experiencing of the world. So it has this alienating effect that you're you're accessing this information about yourself rather than from an embedded, embodied position where you're just existing in the world, to this very quantified way of learning about yourself in this sort of weird, alienated, foreign way, almost like you're taking a third person view of yourself. And I think that's sort of hard to parameterize, but I wonder if that's one long-term effect that all these technologies can have, and that's something maybe big picture that ought to be kept in mind.
Teresa, I agree. I fully agree. And I think there is an additional long-term issue which we haven't discussed so far, which is cognitive enhancement. I think we can reasonably put this issue aside for now, because none of the DTC technologies or DIY technologies developed so far, to my knowledge, has demonstrated strong potential for cognitive enhancement, with some very few notable exceptions. So that there is some research on TMS among healthy adults over the age of 65, if I recall correctly, which show that you can increase performance at memory tasks after modulation, but they are rare. So, but in a long term, we can easily imagine that we will have more effective neuromodulation technology. And this technology can be used for cognitive enhancement purposes. And then one obvious ethical question is, should people have the right to do so? And you have the bioconservatives who argue that people do not have a right to enhance themselves at the cognitive level. I tend to disagree. I've argued that there is such a thing as a right to cognitive liberty, which is the right and freedom of people to make competent decisions about their cognitive domain, including the ability to enhance themselves if they want so. But this right to cognitive enhancement needs to be sort of compensated by or corroborated by right to fair access to the benefits of these technologies. The major risk that we can face on the long term is that we have effective cognitive enhancement neurotechnology that can only be afforded by few. And this is a scenario which I believe is very scary because it can exacerbate pre-existing socioeconomic inequalities, and it can exacerbate these inequalities at the cognitive level and create a sort of two parallel societies with haves and have-nots. So I think this is a scenario that is potentially scary. It's not something that can occur within the next few years, not within this decade, but this is something that is important to keep in mind, I think.
Yeah, and you can see these disparities right now with remote learning. And if you don't have reliable Wi-Fi or you don't have a laptop at home, you fall behind very quickly. And these disparities are exacerbated very quickly in just the 10 months that we've been in the current pandemic. So this, once this technology is truly effective, this is certainly a real concern.
So yeah, I think the way you guys have framed the issues are extremely helpful to our audience, right? I think I just want to highlight a few things, right? It definitely depends on what technology we're looking at. Different technologies, whether they're stimulating or reading your brain, are going to offer different types of ethical questions. And I really appreciate, Anna, how you've laid out, right? There are some pressing questions now ethically, but as Marcello and Carola mentioned, right, over time, as these devices become more effective at doing what they claim to do and become more widespread, we could see a lot of potentially bigger societal level issues coming up. And I think that's a great segue to our last section, where we'll talk a little bit about oversight. So we've identified these problems. What can we actually do to try to mitigate some of these issues if possible? And I'll turn to an audience question, combining a few questions here just for sake of time. But the first one I'll ask is, who or what body, either medical, government, should or should not have oversight over these products? And I'll tie that in with another question that was from Karen Davis, and another question from Michael Young. How is the FDA involved in this? Is that one sort of body that often gets mentioned? What is their role? And I'll just try to limit the conversation because, as you guys mentioned, right, there's DTC versus DIY. For this question, let's focus on DIY users. What do you think is the role of government or bodies in terms of providing oversight of DIY users, including the FDA, if you think that's appropriate?
I can start, and I also want to just mention one point, Ishan, was that I don't think it's necessarily a given when you were saying before that they will become these devices will become effective, or that they will become widespread. So I would say if they become effective and if they become widespread. And also, you have, I want to call out also your fantastic chapter on the regulation of these devices, which is probably the best, incorporation and synthesis of different views that people have had on regulation of DTC neurotech. So you could answer this question too. But anyway, in terms of DIY neurotech, DIY, if we're talking about individuals and not companies, that's really hard to regulate. And I think Marcello made that excellent distinction, right, is if someone's doing this in their home, right, the FDA doesn't have authority to regulate what someone does, right? They have authority to regulate what a company sells in interstate commerce. But really what they regulate what companies can sell, what kinds of claims can be made about a certain product, right? And so the interesting questions here, so for DIY, I would say, other than issuing a consumer alert about a product, the FDA really can't regulate what people are doing in their own homes. To that end, some neuroscientists and neuroethicists have tried an open engagement approach, so to actually write to the DIY communities and sort of engage with them about what the risks may be and what the knowns and unknowns are. Just very briefly, the really interesting question when we get to DTC neurotech is the claims made by the company. So whether they're the consumer or the wellness claims, which is, I know, beyond the scope of what we're going to go into here, but that's the interesting question, I think.
So I think one thing to note is that these DTC neurotechnologies, and Anna and Ishan can definitely speak to this better, but are not regulated by the FDA because they are exempt under the wellness device category. And the idea is that these devices are not medical devices, therefore they don't need to be regulated as medical devices. What is problematic about that is that you can definitely go to these websites of these device makers and read the descriptions and very much come away thinking that, oh, these are going to address my medical issues. So there's a tension between these devices being not regulated as medical devices, but being sort of thought of as by the FDA as wellness devices, and the marketing that the companies put out in order to sell the products as, you know, capitalist companies want to do.
Sure.
Yeah, I share similar views. I probably I tend to be, you know, very much in favor of laissez-faire approaches when it comes to DIY neurotechnology. I see the right of people to self-experiment, and as part of a broadly conceived right to science. Whereas in contrast, I tend to be quite in favor of strict regulation when it comes to DTC products. And I think there is a lot of room for improvement at the regulatory level. And I do not mean exclusively normative governance and mandatory regulatory interventions, but also soft law approaches and self-regulatory approaches by companies. So I had the privilege to work together with the OECD Steering Committee on Neurotechnology, and we released a document at the end of 2019 on responsible innovation in neurotechnology. And this was the first responsible innovation standard in the field. And the aim is precisely to encourage companies to align their products with responsible innovation models and ethical values in a proactive way. Then, of course, this might not be enough. And a lot of people, including Carola, have argued in favor of complementing these approaches with regulatory top-down interventions. And I tend to be quite sympathetic to that, especially when it comes to the governance of brain data. I personally think that there are novel ethical issues here. Again, not because the data that we can collect with DTC products can reveal the content of mental states, but because this data can, once we collect them, they're here to stay. We can use machine learning to mine them. We can aggregate them with other data, and we can, at some point, reveal sensitive information from non-sensitive data. And therefore, the more brain data become part of a broader digital ecosystem and are aggregated and combined with other digitally available data, we need to have a public debate on the status of this data. Right now, in most jurisdictions, the data collected through DTC products do not qualify as health data, as according for example, the EU General Data Protection Regulation, for the reasons that Carola mentioned before. These are not medical devices, and if they are not used within medical facilities, which is typical in a DTC context, then they may be elusive of oversight. And some people in Europe have argued that one possible approach is to consider all brain data as health data, regardless of the devices from which they originate. So it's a kind of regulation that is focusing on the nature of the data and the use of the data, not on the device itself. I think this is a potentially promising approach. And I think another issue that is associated with this is the problem or the issue of monetizing brain data, because of course the major purpose of DTC is to collect data in exchange of services, right? You trade data for services, and this is not new. This is the entire data economy is based on this principle, but it's the first time that the data economy also includes data related to the human central nervous system. And this process of trading data for services is something that requires, in my view, increased scrutiny when it enters the neurocognitive domain.
Great. So just being mindful of time, we have about 5 minutes left. So I'm just going to probably do one last question. And this comes from Juhi. And she asks, I'm curious how much the language messaging of direct-to-consumer, the direct-to-consumer world impacts the DIY world and the research environment. She says, my sense has generally been that many of the claims made by DTC neurotech companies and their technologies and their abilities, particularly the neuromodulation stimulation, are ambitious at best, as some of you have mentioned. Is this shaping what DIY technologists aim for and the way they think and do? And does this have a broader sort of societal expectation on the traditional research world? So sort of, how does the messaging of these DTC companies and what they're saying influence, how DIY users or researchers think about these issues?
So I can start off there. So one thing that I don't think we mentioned yet was the ambitious claims by the big DTC neurotech companies like Neuralink, Kernel, and even Facebook, right? So if you've tuned into any of they've had some live press announcements, right? And the claims that these companies are making are that we're going to, merge with AI, that we're going to cure every disease under the sun with these devices, things like that. And so the claims are really ambitious. And there's a lot of, really in the last few years, there's been really significant investment from Silicon Valley into this space. So I think that's a really interesting phenomenon, being mindful of the time. I will say that I'm not sure what DIY technologists are. So, but I think, or how it might impact them. But I will say that the claims are really interesting because on the one hand, you have the founders of these companies making these claims about the consumer use. But if you actually look to what the scientists are doing, right, I think the scientists in these companies are realizing that they have to go the medical route first. So they're not actually developing the consumer product first. They're going to develop a medical product first and then probably, maybe, possibly later try and get it approved for consumer use. But this leads to this kind of weird performance. Antonio, I forget his last name, Regalado, I think is how you pronounce it, from Technology Review, called it neuroscience theater, right? These DTC company announcements. And so we see these, so I think that's part of the reason why you see this sort of like weird messaging, right? So on the one hand, there's these claims about these consumer uses, but on the other hand, they're not actually going that way. So I'll just leave that there.
Any thoughts, Carola or Marcello?
Yeah, maybe add into this, I think that's a very interesting question about the societal expectations of DIY. I think there is one additional expectation that at least I have, which is that DIY neurotechnology developers can actually help us. Like, they can help us improve neuroscience. This is as occurred in the computer science world, where hackers are very important for progress in computer science. A lot of computer security protocols have been developed by computer hackers, by ethical hackers. I expect that, for example, DIY neuro hackers can help us, for example, improve the security of neurotechnology applications, which we know now that, at least in the DTC domain, is not particularly high. So maybe my last word is really that we can see DIY not just as an odd phenomenon, or as some bioconservatives see it, or even as a ethically problematic sociological phenomenon, but actually as an opportunity that we can take advantage from, and that we can support if we are good at engaging with these communities, establishing partnerships between academia and this grassroots movements, which is something that has already occurred in other domains of science, citizen science partnership, and establish the foundations for fruitful and productive collaboration.
And maybe I can add on to that as my sort of final word, that I believe that it could be very much a fruitful direction, and what needs to be thought about as once we go that direction is what kinds of rewards or responsibilities then, how should we conceptualize the norms that govern this sort of relationship? Because if citizen science are doing a lot of the work, and the academic scientists are the ones who are publishing the papers and getting the credit and maybe getting the tenure or whatever, and the citizen scientists, because they're not part of that institutional framework, are not captured by those norms and those structures, something's a little bit off. So I think there's a lot of room there for thinking through what kind of a role what kind of a role does the citizen scientist fit into, and to make sure that that role is ethical.
Great. So that actually perfectly brings us to time. I'd like to thank again our terrific panelists, Marcello, Carola, and Anna. Thank you so much for being here. I also really want to thank our audience and just remind everyone, this is the first in a series of 6 planned webinars. And lastly, I just want to point out, if you guys are still more interested in DIY, DTC neurotechnology issues, in the chat, Nicole Martinez mentioned the Developments in Neuroethics and Bioethics, Volume 3, Ethical Dimensions of Commercial and DIY Neurotechnologies. It's a fantastic volume that collects the work of a lot of us here, and is a great jumping off point in terms of the ethics of this issue. Otherwise, great again, and thank you for the great discussion, and goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.